Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes today. We're diving deep into the Code of Hammurabi, King of Babylon, about 2250 BC.
Oh, wow.
It's a fascinating document, a collection of laws from
One of the
one
oldest.
of the oldest civilizations in the world.
Absolutely. And you know what makes it particularly intriguing is how it's presented. This isn't just a set of rules scribbled on a piece of parchment.
Right.
We're talking about laws literally carved in stone on a nearly 8-foot tall monument, a diorite stele, discovered not in Babylon, but in Susa, modern-day Iran.
Okay, so right off the bat, we have a bit of a mystery. What's a Babylonian monument doing in Iran?
Excellent question. It was likely taken as plunder by an Elamite conqueror around 1100 BC. Think of it as an ancient war trophy.
Huh.
But what's really fascinating is that we found fragments of other copies, which suggests the code wasn't just a one-off, but was actually distributed throughout the Babylonian Empire.
So Hammurabi wasn't just laying down the law, he was broadcasting it. What does that tell us about his intentions?
Wow. It suggests he wanted these laws to be known, understood, and followed throughout his realm. It's a statement of power, but also a blueprint for an ordered society.
A blueprint for society, I like that. So let's dive into the blueprint itself. What are the main themes or principles that run through this code?
Well, one of the most prominent is the idea of lex talionis, often summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's a concept of retributive justice, where the punishment fits the crime.
That sounds pretty harsh by today's standards.
It was certainly a different time, but beyond the literal interpretation, lex talionis also reflects a desire for balance and proportionality in the legal system. The severity of the punishment was meant to match the severity of the offense.
So it's about establishing a sense of fairness, even if it seems harsh to us now. What else jumps out at you as a major theme?
Well, the code is deeply concerned with social hierarchy. Punishments varied wildly depending on your social standing. For example, injuring a slave carried a lighter penalty than injuring a freeman.
It seems like equality wasn't exactly a Babylonian value.
It was a very stratified society. This hierarchical structure is woven throughout the code, impacting everything from property rights to family law to punishments for crimes.
Okay, so we've got retributive justice and a rigid social hierarchy. What other building blocks make up this blueprint for society?
Well, property rights are a huge focus. The code meticulously outlines regulations for buying, selling, renting, inheriting, you name it.
Wow.
They even had rules for the responsibilities of shepherds, imagine. Legal protection for your flock of sheep back in 2250 BC.
Wow. So Hammurabi was a shepherd's best friend. But seriously, it sounds like they took property rights very seriously. Why do you think that was?
Well, remember, this was a predominantly agrarian society. Land, livestock, and other possessions were the foundation of their livelihood and stability. Protecting those assets was crucial for maintaining social order.
It makes sense. No one wants their sheep stolen. But let's step back from it. We've talked about the major themes, but what about the structure of the code itself? How is it organized?
It's quite structured. It opens with a prologue, where Hammurabi boasts about his achievements, his piety, and his divine right to rule. It's almost like a self-promotional campaign for his kingship.
Well, every good leader needs good PR, even in ancient Babylon. What comes after this royal resume?
Then we get to the heart of the matter, a series of 282 laws covering a wide range of topics, from family matters to business transactions to agriculture and beyond. Each law is presented in a case-based format, starting with if a man, and then outlining the specific circumstances and the corresponding legal consequence.
That's a pretty straightforward approach. If this, then that. No room for ambiguity, it seems.
Exactly. And this clarity was likely intentional, remember?
Right.
The goal was for these laws to be easily understood and applied. They needed to be practical and readily accessible, even to those who couldn't read.
So it's a legal system designed for the real world, for everyday disputes and challenges. What follows these 282 laws?
The code concludes with an epilogue. It echoes the prologue, emphasizing Hammurabi's righteousness and warning future rulers against tampering with his divinely ordained laws.
So it's like a message from beyond the grave, a final assertion of authority. I'm already starting to see why this code has had such a lasting impact. It's a fascinating blend of legal principles, social values, and even a bit of political maneuvering. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Can we walk through some of the individual laws? I'm dying to hear what kinds of things they covered.
Absolutely. Why don't we start with the very first law, which deals with false accusations. It's a prime example of that eye for an eye principle we were talking about.
Okay, let's hear it. What does law number 1 have to say?
It states that if someone accuses another person of a capital crime but fails to prove it, the accusers shall be put to death.
Wow, it's high stakes. It seems they were pretty serious about deterring false accusations. But it also raises some interesting questions. What if someone genuinely believed they were witnessing a crime? Were there any safeguards against accidental misinterpretations?
That's a great point. And it highlights one of the limitations of a purely retributive system. There's not much room for nuance or mitigating circumstances.
It makes you wonder how these laws were actually applied in practice. Was it always a strict eye for an eye? Or was there room for interpretation and judgment?
That's a question that continues to intrigue scholars, unfortunately. The code itself doesn't give us many clues about the day-to-day workings of the Babylonian legal system. We can only infer so much from the written laws themselves.
It's like we have a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. But even with just this piece, we're starting to get a glimpse into the minds of the people who lived under this code. What other fascinating laws can you share?
Well, one that often captures people's imagination is the law regarding trial by ordeal, specifically the ordeal by water.
Ah, trial by ordeal. That sounds traumatic. Tell me more.
Imagine this. A woman is accused of adultery. To prove her innocence, she's forced to jump into a river. If she survives, she's considered innocent, as the gods have intervened on her behalf. If she drowns, well, it's seen as divine proof of guilt.
That's quite a gamble. It makes you realize how differently they viewed the world back then, and how much faith they placed in the judgment of the gods.
Absolutely. It's a far cry from our modern legal system, which relies on evidence, witnesses, and reasoned arguments. But in ancient Babylon, divine intervention was seen as a legitimate means of determining guilt or innocence.
It's a reminder that the concept of justice has evolved significantly over time. But what's also striking is how deeply intertwined law and religion were in their society. The gods weren't just abstract beings. They played an active role in their legal system.
Precisely. And this connection to the divine is further emphasized in the code's prologue and epilogue, where Hammurabi claims to be acting on the will of the gods. It's all part of that carefully constructed image of a ruler whose authority is rooted in something higher than himself.
It's fascinating how these laws reveal not just their legal principles, but also their religious beliefs, their worldview, and even their political strategies. We're really starting to uncover the layers of complexity hidden within this ancient text. But before we get too carried away, let's take a moment to consider. What does this all mean for the average Babylonian? How did these laws actually impact their daily lives?
That's a crucial question, and to answer it, we need to move beyond the grand pronouncements of the prologue and delve into the specifics of those 282 laws, because that's where we see how this blueprint for society was actually implemented, how it regulated their relationships, their businesses, and their very existence.
So it's time to roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty of Babylonian law. From marriage contracts to building codes to agricultural regulations, let's explore how Hammurabi's code shaped the lives of the people who lived under its rule.
I'm ready to dive in. Let's start by exploring the laws that governed family life in ancient Babylon.
Okay, let's unpack this. Marriage, divorce, inheritance. I'm ready to hear what Hammurabi had to say about it all.
Family was central to Babylonian society, and the code reflects this. It dedicates a significant portion to marriage, divorce, and the intricate web of rights and responsibilities within a household.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how these ancient laws reflect their societal values. What stands out to you when you look at these family laws?
One thing that strikes me is the emphasis on contractual agreements, even within the realm of marriage. The code details how marriage contracts should be drawn up, including provisions for dowries and even prenuptial agreements.
Prenuptial agreements in ancient Babylon. That's a surprise. It seems like some things never changed. Why do you think they were so focused on formalizing these relationships?
Well, remember, marriage wasn't just about love and companionship in their society. It was also an economic and social contract, a way to ensure the continuation of family lines and the transmission of property.
So these marriage contracts were about protecting both personal and financial interests. What about divorce? Was that allowed under the code?
Divorce was permitted, but it wasn't taken lightly. The code outlined specific grounds for divorce, such as adultery or desertion, and the consequences varied depending on who initiated the separation and the reasons behind it.
Okay. It sounds like a complex process. Can you give us an example of how these divorce laws played out?
Sure. Let's say a husband wanted to divorce his wife without a valid reason. He could do so, but he'd have to return her dowry and potentially pay her additional compensation. On the other hand, if the wife was found at fault, She could lose her dowry and even face exile from her community.
Oh, wow. So the consequences could be pretty severe,
Mm.
especially for women. It seems like the scales were often tipped in favor of the husband.
Yes, there's a clear patriarchal structure reflected in these laws. Women, while afforded some legal protections, were largely under the authority of men, first their fathers, then their husbands.
Yeah. It paints a picture of a society where women's rights were limited. What about inheritance? How did that work under the code?
Inheritance laws were intricate and depended on various factors. Legitimate sons typically inherited equal shares of their father's estate. However, the code also includes provisions for illegitimate children, adopted sons, and even daughters in certain circumstances.
It's interesting how they had to consider all these different scenarios. What happened if a man died without any heirs?
In those cases, the property could revert back to the state or be distributed among extended family members. The code aimed to ensure that property was properly managed and passed down through generations, even in the absence of direct heirs.
Right. It sounds like they had a well-developed system for dealing with these complex family matters. But moving beyond the family unit, the code also addresses a wide range of other social issues. What can you tell us about those?
Well, one area that often draws attention is the code's approach to criminal justice. As we mentioned earlier, the principle of lex talionis looms large, with punishments often mirroring the crime.
An eye for an eye.
Right.
Right. What kind of offenses did they consider serious enough to warrant such harsh punishments?
Theft, assault, and murder were obviously taken very seriously. But the code also dealt with offenses that we might consider less severe today, such as slander, fraud, and even professional negligence.
Professional negligence. What kind of jobs were they regulating back then?
Well, they had laws pertaining to builders, physicians, and even ship captains, for instance. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder could face the death penalty.
Wow. Talk about accountability. I guess they weren't messing around when it came to building safety. What about doctors? What kind of legal risks did they face?
Well, there's a famous law that states if a physician performs a surgery and the patient dies or loses an eye, the physician's hand shall be cut off. It highlights the high stakes involved in medical practice in ancient Babylon.
Yeah, that's a pretty extreme consequence for a medical mistake. It makes you appreciate modern medical regulations and malpractice insurance. But these examples also make me wonder, was there any room for leniency or mercy in their legal system?
That's a great question, and it's one that scholars continue to debate. The code itself doesn't offer much in the way of mitigating circumstances or alternative punishments. However, some historians speculate that in practice, there may have been room for judges or officials to exercise some discretion based on individual cases.
So maybe the actual application of the law was more nuanced than the black and white pronouncements of the code might suggest. It's fascinating to think about the gap between the written law and the lived reality of the legal system.
Precisely, and that gap is something we always have to grapple with when studying ancient history. We have to rely on the available evidence, but also acknowledge that there's much we may never know about how these laws were interpreted and enforced in everyday life.
It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, but a complex tapestry woven from interpretations, perspectives, and unanswered questions.
Well said. And as we continue our exploration of Hammurabi's code, it's important to keep that perspective in mind. We can marvel at the sophistication of this ancient legal system, but also recognize that it operated within a very different social, cultural, and religious context than our own.
It's a challenge, but also an exciting opportunity to step outside our own assumptions and try to understand the world through the eyes of the Babylonians. So what other areas of Babylonian life does the code illuminate? Where else can we find these glimpses into their world?
Well, one area that provides fascinating insights is their approach to economic activity. The code dedicates a significant portion to regulating commerce, trade, and even financial matters.
Okay, let's unpack this. What can we learn about their business practices from these laws?
Well, for starters, they had a very sophisticated system for contracts. The code outlines how contracts should be drawn up, witnessed, and enforced. It even covers issues like breach of contract and penalties for non-compliance.
So they had a legal framework for ensuring that agreements were honored. It sounds like they were pretty serious about maintaining order in the marketplace.
They were, and it makes sense when you consider that trade was a vital part of their economy. Babylon was a hub of commercial activity, and these laws helped facilitate and regulate those transactions.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how these ancient laws reflect the economic realities of their time. What other kinds of business dealings did they regulate?
The code covers a wide range of transactions, from loans and partnerships to the rental of property, and even the hiring of laborers.
It sounds like they had laws governing almost every aspect of commerce. What were their views on debt and lending?
Debt was a serious matter in Babylonian society. The code outlines various options for creditors to recoup their losses, including the right to seize property or even force the debtor into servitude.
That sounds pretty harsh. Were there any protections for debtors?
There were some safeguards in place. For instance, the code sets limits on the amount of interest that can be charged on loans, and it also protects certain types of property from being seized to satisfy debts.
So it was a balancing act between protecting the rights of creditors and ensuring that debtors weren't completely ruined. It's interesting how they tried to find a middle ground, even in a system that could be quite unforgiving.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes the code so fascinating to study. It reveals a society that was grappling with many of the same economic challenges that we face today. Issues of fairness, balance, and the need to regulate complex financial systems.
Right. It's a reminder that even across millennia, we share some fundamental concerns about how to create a just and prosperous society. But as much as I'm enjoying this deep dive into the economic realities of ancient Babylon, I'm also curious about other aspects of their daily lives. What other fascinating details can we uncover from this code?
Well, one area that often sparks curiosity is their approach to agriculture, a cornerstone of their economy. The code dedicates several laws to regulating irrigation, crop rotation, and even the responsibilities of shepherds.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about these agricultural laws. What kind of things did they cover?
They had laws governing the sharing of water resources, ensuring that everyone had access to irrigation for their crops. They also had rules about livestock, including penalties for allowing animals to damage another person's fields.
So they were trying to prevent conflicts over resources and protect the livelihoods of farmers. It makes sense, given how important agriculture was to their society.
Precisely. And these laws weren't just abstract principles. They were designed to address practical concerns and maintain a stable agricultural system. They even had rules about the rental of oxen for plowing and the wages to be paid to agricultural laborers.
Wow. It's amazing how detailed and specific these laws were. It really gives us a glimpse into the everyday workings of their agricultural economy.
It does, and it highlights how intertwined their legal system was with the practical realities of their lives. The code wasn't just a set of lofty pronouncements. It was a tool for regulating and managing the very foundations of their society.
Like a legal handbook for life in ancient Babylon. From marriage contracts to building codes to agricultural regulations, it seems like they had a law for almost every aspect of their existence.
You're absolutely right. And as we delve deeper into the code, we continue to uncover these fascinating insights into their world, their values, and their approach to creating a functioning and, in their view, just society.
It's incredible how much ground we've covered, from marriage and divorce to criminal justice and even the intricacies of Babylonian agriculture. But I feel like there's still so much to explore.
Oh, you're right. Hammurabi's code is remarkably comprehensive, touching on aspects of life we haven't even touched upon, for instance. It delves into matters of inheritance and adoption, offering a glimpse into how they viewed family lineage and the transfer of wealth.
Yeah, it's like each law is a tiny window into their worldview, their values, their beliefs. What stands out to you as particularly revealing about Babylonian society?
What's fascinating is the attention to detail. The code doesn't just state general principles, it provides specific scenarios and corresponding judgments. It's like they anticipated potential conflicts and sought to provide clear resolutions, for example. There's a law that addresses what happens if a man's ox gores another man's ox. It outlines different outcomes depending on whether the goring ox was known to be dangerous or if the incident occurred on public land.
Right. It's those kinds of details that really bring this ancient legal system to life. They weren't just dealing with abstract concepts. They were tackling the messy realities of daily life in a bustling city.
Exactly. And it's in those specifics that we see the code's practicality. It wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a framework for a functioning society, for resolving disputes, and ensuring a degree of order and predictability in people's lives.
It's like they were trying to create a rule book for every possible scenario. But it also makes me wonder, how rigid was this code in practice? Was there any room for interpretation or flexibility?
That's a question historians continue to debate. While the code itself appears quite strict and prescriptive, we have to remember that we're only seeing the written text. We don't have a complete picture of how these laws were applied in individual cases. It's possible that judges or officials had some discretion in interpreting and enforcing the code based on specific circumstances.
So the reality of Babylonian law might have been more nuanced than the black and white text might suggest. It's a reminder that even with ancient documents, we're always dealing with a partial perspective, a glimpse into a world we can never fully comprehend.
Precisely. And that's part of what makes studying ancient history so captivating. It's a constant process of piecing together fragments of evidence, interpreting texts, and trying to imagine ourselves into a very different time and place.
Speaking of imagining ourselves back then, I'm curious about how the average Babylonian would have encountered this code. Was it something they studied and memorized? Or was it more of a reference point for when disputes arose?
That's an intriguing question. Given that literacy was limited in ancient Babylon, it's unlikely that most people would have had personal copies of the code or been able to read it in its entirety.
So how did they learn about these laws?
Well, remember, the stele itself was a public monument. It was prominently displayed, likely in a central location where people would regularly see it.
So as a visual reminder of the law, even if they couldn't read the specific pronouncements.
Exactly. And there may have been other ways the laws were communicated or disseminated. Perhaps officials or scribes would read pronouncements publicly, or there might have been a system of oral tradition where legal knowledge was passed down through generations.
It makes you wonder about the role of legal experts in their society. Were there lawyers or judges who specialized in interpreting and applying the code?
There certainly would have been individuals with specialized knowledge of the law. Scribes, for instance, would have played a crucial role in drafting contracts, documenting legal proceedings, and ensuring that legal pronouncements were accurately recorded.
So even in an ancient society, they had a need for legal professionals. It's fascinating to think about the continuities and differences between their legal system and our own.
Absolutely. And while the specific laws and punishments may seem foreign to us, the underlying principles of justice, fairness, and the rule of law resonate even today. Hammurabi's Code, despite its antiquity, still has something to teach us about the enduring human quest for order, accountability, and a system for resolving conflicts peacefully.
It's a powerful reminder that the questions of law and justice have been central to human societies for millennia. And by exploring these ancient legal systems, we gain a deeper understanding not just of the past, but of ourselves and the challenges we continue to face today.
Well said. And I think that's a fitting note on which to conclude our deep dive into Hammurabi's Code. It's been an incredible journey through ancient Babylon, exploring a legal system that, while vastly different from our own, offers profound insights into the human condition.
I couldn't agree more. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I feel like I've learned so much about ancient Babylon, about law, and even about ourselves in the process.
And who knows? Maybe this deep dive has sparked a curiosity in our listeners to explore other ancient legal systems or to delve deeper into the world of ancient history.
That would be fantastic. There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered. But for now, it's time for us to sign off. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Hammurabi's Code. We'll catch you next time on Books and Bytes.